Struggling with irregular cycles and feeling like your fertility is out of your control? You're tracking ovulation, peeing on endless strips, and still wondering, am I actually ovulating? When is my fertile window? In today's episode, I'm joined by fertility awareness expert Lisa Hendrickson-Jack, and we're breaking it all down. How to track ovulation the right way, what your cycle is really telling you about your hormones, and how to fix irregular periods to boost your chances of conception. If your only education on your menstrual cycle and fertility came from 6th grade health class or something you read in a Facebook group, this episode is for you. Feeling like this whole baby-making journey is never going to work out? You've done it all, diet changes, supplements, tracking your cycle, and yet the pregnancy test is negative. It's so frustrating, and you're asking yourself, why isn't this happening for us? I'm Susan Gladstein, a holistic fertility coach and mom to 7, including 2 miracle babies after a vasectomy reversal, and I get it. Being told everything looks fine by doctors while still feeling stuck can leave you feeling hopeless and confused. On this podcast, I'll share practical, natural ways to support your fertility without all the overwhelm. Forget the everything's normal talk and the rush into fertility treatments. I'm here to show you a better way. If you're ready to take practical steps that fit with God's plan for your family, you're in the right place. I truly believe that you can have the baby you've been praying for. I'm so thrilled to have Lisa here with us. She is a certified fertility awareness educator, a holistic reproductive health practitioner, and the founder of the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program. She's also the author of 3 best-selling books, including The Fifth Vital Sign and Real Food for Fertility, which she co-authored with Lily Nichols. She's a powerhouse in the world of fertility awareness, working to debunk that myth that ovulation only matters when you're trying to conceive. And today we're going to dive into how irregular cycles can impact fertility, and more importantly, what you can do to regulate your period and increase your chances of conceiving. So welcome to the show. I'm super excited to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
And before we dive into all the fertility awareness wisdom that you have to share, I would love for you to kind of take us back to the beginning. What led you to be so passionate about the menstrual cycle health and fertility awareness and all the things?
Well, I will try to keep it brief because, of course, it's always a long story, right? But when my very first period, when I was in my teens, I think it was 13, it was painful and heavy from the get-go. And I was a very active child. I did ballet and track and all the things. And I went to my doctor, back then, because girls talked, there was no internet back then. And I basically said 2 words, and then I was put on the pill. And I wasn't on the pill for birth control at the time. And like a child, I thought, okay, I'm fixed. I'm good. So every now and then I would come off the pill just to see what would happen. And when I would do that, my actual real cycle would come back and it would be painful and heavy. So I didn't have the language to understand what was going on. So now I understand that when you're on hormonal birth control, it's a withdrawal bleed. It's not a true menstrual period. But back then I just knew that it was different, and I knew that the pill wasn't fixing my problem. So then when I actually did need birth control, I decided to come off the pill because I felt more comfortable not using it. I felt more comfortable using condoms. And then it was around that time that I discovered fertility awareness, and it was really revolutionary. So I was probably about 18-ish years old when I discovered fertility awareness. And I learned that you can only get pregnant in a short window of time in your cycle. And I learned that everything that we were taught in that 6th grade class was basically wrong, because they told us that you could get pregnant every day. It didn't matter. There was no safe time. And I remember just being terrified all the time. In fact, that was one of the reasons I wanted to come off the pill, because I was so terrified that I might miss a pill and get pregnant and not know, because sometimes I would take 2 pill packs at back to back if I wanted to skip the bleed. And I was terrified that I could get pregnant and not know. So that's how terrified I was. I was very terrified. But then when I learned this information, it changed everything. And I no longer felt terrified. I actually felt a lot more empowered. And maybe it's the opposite experience for a lot of women, but I felt more confident and comfortable off birth control because I knew what was happening in my body. So that was how it started. And then somewhere along my journey, I'm charting my cycles and I start working with some instructors and I took a class in my 20s. I've been at this for a long time. And my charting instructor looks at my cycles and she says, you know, your temperatures are too low and your cycles are too long. I think you should get checked for thyroid. And it turned out I had a subclinical thyroid issue. And I thought, what? You looked at my chart and came up with that? So that was kind of like that second part of my journey. The first part was like, this is just really cool to be able to use this as a birth control method. And, you know, when my husband and I, you know, later on were ready to try to conceive, we used it as conception. Like that part is really, really cool. But obviously the title of my first book, The Fifth Vital Sign, is because that was really this kind of foundational shift in my mind to learn that not only is this cool, but our cycles are actually always showing us what's going on. They are our fifth vital sign. And so by looking into our cycles, learning what's normal, what's not, understanding that a healthy cycle is a reflection of a healthy body. And if your cycle is off, as you mentioned, irregular cycles and different challenges, there typically is a kind of foundational underlying reason why that is. So that connection has shifted everything for me. And that is why I'm still passionate about it to this day.
It's so true that they really did us a injustice at sixth grade health class, trying to say, like, yeah, well, if you just look at a boy, you're probably going to get pregnant at any moment of every month. So you talked about the fifth vital sign. How can women use their cycle as a diagnostic tool to help them uncover any underlying health issues, kind of like your instructor did for you?
Well, so I feel like there's layers of it. I mean, at the very basic level, because what I always say is that, you know, if you go deep into the rabbit hole with me and you learn to chart your cycles with a specific fertility awareness based method, you know, there's a lot of like that, there's a lot of value in actually going all the way and doing all of that. But at a most basic level, I think that we can have a bit of body literacy, a bit of general basic understanding about how our cycles work and how our bodies work. And I think that that starts with understanding what's normal and what's not normal in terms of what the menstrual cycle is, because that's not something that most women are aware of. There's a lot of things that are very common, but not optimal that we just accept, like having raging PMS that actually is problematic, or having really painful periods that require medication. So I think, you know, if we go through what a normal healthy cycle looks like, first of all, a healthy cycle should range somewhere between about 24 to 35 days with an average of about 29 days. So I think even defining what an irregular cycle is helpful, because an irregular cycle is actually defined as a cycle that is regularly more than about 8 days different. So for example, if your cycle is 29 days one month and 32 days another month, and then like 27 days the next month, that actually isn't irregular. That just falls into normal cycle fluctuations. Whereas if your cycle was like 38 days one month, 25 days the next, and like 42 or something like that, that would fall into the definition of irregular. And then if we break the cycle down into its parts, the first day of your menstrual cycle is the first day of your period, the first day of your true flow. So some women may experience some spotting leading up to their actual period when it starts, but we would count the first day of the true flow. And so your period, on average, should be about 5 days or so, but it can range anywhere from 3 to 7 days, like a healthy period. And I always say a period should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then it should be over like a sentence. So we would expect your period to start moderate to heavy and then kind of gradually taper off. And there can be some days included in that of like a little bit of spotting, tail end bleeding, and things like that. But if your period, you know, then it stops, but then 2 days later you're bleeding again and you have bleeding throughout the whole cycle, or we want to be clear that although it might be common in some cases, is not optimal and certainly falls outside of what we would consider to be ideal. And so the other thing, and I feel like sometimes it can be kind of controversial to say this because it is so common for women to experience period pain, but having pain that is moderate to severe, that requires the use of medication, that debilitates you, that you can't function, that is not considered to be optimal as well. So I could go on a little bit about that, but I'll just kind of pause on that. And if you want to ask me more questions about that, I can certainly get into it. So that's what a healthy period would look like in a nutshell. And then when you move into the other phases of the cycle, so once your period is done, you're in your pre-ovulatory phase. So that's the phase leading up to ovulation. So in a healthy cycle, in order for your cycle to fall within that 24 to 35 day range, ovulation typically has to happen somewhere between days 10 and 22-ish. So that is important. You need to ovulate for the cycle to be healthy. Leading up to ovulation, we would expect to produce some cervical fluid. So that can look like the creamy white hand lotion. It can look like raw, clear egg whites. And so 2 to 7 days of that fluid leading up to ovulation is what we would consider to be normal. And then once you ovulate, that's when you start making progesterone, and the progesterone shuts down that mucus production. So, in a healthy cycle, that second half, that luteal phase or that post-ovulatory phase, we would expect it to be about 12 days. So 12 to 14 days would be ideal. So when I kind of go through that, I think that is the first step to learning and understanding this concept of using your cycle as a vital sign, because we first have to establish like what is actually normal. If you think about your other vital signs like your body temperature or your blood pressure, in order for your doctor to know if you're healthy, they're going to have to know what the range is of normal. And so if your blood pressure was too high or too low, then if it's too high, it doesn't only tell them that there's something wrong, but it tells them that, there's a few things that could cause high blood pressure. So they're going to have a starting point to look for. And similarly, if we break the cycle down into these various parts, it could be something as simple as, I mentioned the cervical fluid, we'd expect 2 to 7 days, like leading up to ovulation. Well, if you have discharge every day, that could be something as basic as having an infection. But given that the range of cycle length, average 29 days, if you go 80 days without a period, I mean, that's a pretty big flag. And women who have extended periods of hypothalamic amenorrhea, for example, where they stop bleeding altogether, that's associated with an increased risk of osteoporosis and other significant health issues. So there is a connection between healthy cycles and overall health. And when the cycle's abnormal, that's the starting point. But then we can kind of dig deeper into what some of the factors may be.
I wholeheartedly like appreciate just breaking it down because I feel like so many people in this community, they're reading and they're obsessively taking their OPK tests and not sure even how to read them or what's going on. And, I'm kind of well, is that the only thing that you're using? I mean, I'll be quite honest. When I was trying to conceive our vasectomy reversal baby, I just basically plugged my period into an app and had it tell me when my window was. So, like, I probably missed it quite a bit because of that. And you and I were talking about that beforehand. But yeah, even just understanding when is your fertile window and how to determine if you are actually ovulating. What are some things that people should be looking for or utilizing as tools to help them predict their fertile window and if they're actually ovulating?
hmm I mean, there's a whole lot I could say about that. I could go on about that for the rest of the time. But I think from my perspective, so given that my background is in fertility awareness cycle charting, I do come at it from a certain perspective. So when you understand your cycle, like I said, I broke down, what the healthy cycle looks like. And so the key is to first understand what's happening biologically. So the way our bodies are designed is that when we produce this cervical mucus leading up to ovulation, what's happening there? So you have your period, and then during that pre-ovulatory phase of the cycle, your ovaries are developing these follicles, and the follicle is simply the sac where the egg is. And so, toward the beginning of your cycle, you have a little pool of follicles that are starting to develop. And as they develop, one is eventually chosen to be the dominant, and that one goes on to grow to 20 times its size, and that's what, ovulates and releases the egg, assuming that you have a healthy cycle. And so, as this process is happening in the pre-ovulatory phase, it is those follicles that are producing estrogen, and it's the estrogen that the follicles are producing that are stimulating your mucus production. And the mucus is what has the potential to keep the sperm alive for up to 5 days. So, mucus plays a really interesting, essential role in fertility. And I would say the first step to understanding how to time sex correctly, to know if you're ovulating, is to really kind of dive in and start understanding your cervical mucus. So like I said, it's the creamy white hand lotion looking stuff or the clear stretchy stuff. If you go to the bathroom sometimes and you wipe and it's like, whew, I joke like the hand hits the back of the toilet, or those days where you feel kind of wet down there, but like you didn't ever really know what that was. I remember when I was a teenager, and I was going through this puberty phase, and all of a sudden there were these days where I would feel really wet down there. And I remember I asked my mom about it, and she was like, well, you just wear a panty liner. She didn't know either, right? And looking back, reflecting back, that was my cervical mucus days, but I just didn't know. So the key thing, there's a couple things. So one, cervical mucus really helps us to understand timing. So regardless of how much you have, because that can change with age. As we get older, there's some research that shows that we have fewer crypts that make that, raw, stretchy cream, like raw, stretchy egg white looking mucus. So not all women have the same amount. It's not always abundant, but having it there and being able to identify, even just when you have that kind of slippery sensation when you're wiping, tells us that your cervix is open. So when you learn the biology, it's like it's so interesting and it's really a rabbit hole. So, but to make it simple, there's I like to use silly analogies. So my analogy for the cervical opening and closing is like if you were to go to a nightclub and like when you are in that fertile window, the bouncer at the door is like out to lunch. He's having his sandwich or whatever and he's not there. So everyone can kind of go in the club, right? But when you are outside of that fertile window, the bouncer is there and no one can get in. And so our cervical mucus plays this crucial role. It actually acts as kind of like a gate or an opening or a valve where when we're in that window and the cervical mucus is flowing and we're seeing it in our underwear and we're wiping it off and all of that, that tells us that the cervix is actually open. And when you have mucus that is of that kind of clear, stretchy quality, the highest quantity and best quality, like the clear, stretchy stuff, then that is most highly correlated with ovulation. So there's really interesting studies where there was this one study that I'm thinking of where they taught women just how to tell the different types of mucus that they had. And they rated them on a score of 1 to 4 with like the clear, stretchy at the top of the scale. And just by providing them that information and having these women time sex on the days that they observed that kind of highest quality cervical mucus, they had a significant improvement in their chances of conception. And it was equal to or greater than the ovulation strips. So, like, all of that in a nutshell is like pay attention to your mucus. And when you see that clear, stretchy stuff, that's when you have sex. And that's regardless of what day it is, because this is the other challenge where we're so programmed to think that all of our cycles are 28 days and ovulation always happens on day 14. So if you see that stretchy mucus on day 10, you might talk yourself out of it because you'll say, oh, it's too early. But, as we get older too, like the ovulation sometimes can happen a bit sooner. So the average cycle length of women in their 40s tends to be a little bit shorter than the average cycle length outside of that time frame. So whereas I mentioned the average cycle length is about 29 days, for women in their 40s, it's more like 26 days, like the early 40s. So ovulation can start happening sooner. So we don't want to be paying attention to the calendar. We don't want to assume like your app, we don't want to assume that every cycle is going to be the same as the last one. We want to be flexible and we want to be open to the fact that ovulation can happen earlier or later. So the cervix would be the primary sign if I ran the world. And then the ovulation strips would be the secondary sign because ovulation strips are also very helpful. They tend to turn positive about 24 to 36 hours prior to ovulation. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding because I think a lot of women pee on the strip, it turns positive, and they think it means they are currently ovulating or it means that they have already ovulated, like it confirms that they ovulated. So it does neither of those things. Like it is measuring the surge of luteinizing hormone that happens prior to ovulation. So the best way for me to describe that surge, because we're getting into all the science, is if you picture your ovary as a balloon, one of my favorite people taught me this analogy. If you picture your ovary as a balloon, the LH is the pin that pricks it and causes ovulation to happen. And so that is what it's testing for. And they're not perfect because there can be false negatives and false positives in different situations. So, but the wonderful combination of mucus plus the strips, if you want to add in a little bit of understanding about temperature, which we could talk about to confirm that ovulation has happened after the fact, then even just with those 3 pieces of information, like way more than anyone else who went to that grade 6 class. Like you're golden.
Yes, I appreciate and I like the balloon analogy because that's something that I see a lot is there's a lot of sort of faith and confidence that goes into the strips and then it's like depending on what time of day you're testing like you may not actually end up seeing the peak and so then that's like raises all this question and I think only adds to the stress of it all. And stress is a huge thing that I see in this community as far as, I mean, stress is a reality for everybody, but even more so, I feel like it's amplified. And certainly if you're trying to conceive, stress is not going to be helpful to your hormones. So I try to do whatever to help my clients sort of reduce their stress levels. And sometimes that means like, don't be tracking. If it's causing you stress, I get a lot of, well, what if should I go inverted? Should I get a cup? Should I do this? Should I do that? And I'm like, sis, if that makes the time with your spouse like that much more fun, go for it. But if it stresses you out, like let it go. Because people will tell me, well, it used to be that my husband would just look at me and I would get pregnant. I'm like, then do that. That's what you want to do, right?
Yeah.
But we get so caught up in all of that. And I would love for you to touch a little bit on temperature because it's something that I think is a tool, although obviously it comes with some challenges in timing, and there's tons of great now like apps and things that can help support that if you're not, great at being consistent and doing all that. But I would love for you to talk about that just because, again, sixth grade health class did not teach us about that, but it is something that comes up a lot.
Well, it's funny because I remember, I feel like I'm remembering this right, but I remember back in the day when, soap operas were on the TV all the time. I don't even know if they're still on. Like some of them have stopped now. But I remember it was probably like Y&R, like Young and the Restless or something. And I remember this scene where it was probably like Jill or something stupid. But anyways, like I'm not going to go that deep. But someone was, like taking their time. It was so dumb. They were taking their temperature in the middle of the day. And it was like, oh my gosh, my temperature went up. Let's have sex because they were trying to get pregnant. I don't know why to this day I still remember that, but it's like that's it's wrong. So temperature does not help you to predict anything. Temperature actually confirms if ovulation has already happened. And that's again, we have to go back to the biology to understand what it's actually measuring. So I mentioned the menstrual cycle. I said in the pre-ovulatory phase, the follicles are developing, and as they develop, they're making estrogen. And then once you ovulate, that same follicle that was making estrogen turns into the corpus luteum, which then starts to make progesterone. So this is a long way to say that after ovulation is the only time in your cycle where you produce significant progesterone. And progesterone specifically has a thermogenic effect on the body. So when our progesterone levels have risen after ovulation, our body temperature actually increases, and we can measure that with the temperature. So what we're getting with the temperature is, for example, if I was ovulating today, I wouldn't necessarily know that based on my temperature. It would only be after, like the day after or the day after that, when my temperature now has risen as a result of that progesterone rising, that I can retrospectively look back and say, okay, I was ovulating on this day. So I think that's really helpful, just basic knowledge. So in one of the questions you had mentioned, how do we predict ovulation? And as someone who's so steeped in the fertility awareness world, I don't often love that word of predicting ovulation, because from a fertility awareness lens, we're not trying to predict ovulation. That might sound really weird, but go with it for a minute. What we're trying to do is understand how our cycle works. If the mucus keeps the sperm alive for up to 5 days, and if we make mucus as a result of the estrogen is highest right before ovulation. So it's like the system is designed in like this magical, wonderful way where you legitimately would be having the best quality and highest quantity cervical mucus right at the right time, right before that ovulation happens, right? So in that, from that perspective, we're actually looking to identify your fertile days. We're not necessarily trying to predict ovulation. And we're trying to have sex on the fertile days, literally based on the real-time observation of what you saw today. And then the temperature comes in to help us confirm, because sometimes you can have mucus, but then you can get on a plane and go through some stressful event or get some bad news, or something's going on. Your sister's getting married. And even though it's a happy occasion, aunt whatever is freaking out, so it's stressful. And so whatever is the case, sometimes you have all those signs, even a positive ovulation strip, and ovulation doesn't actually occur. It could be delayed, and then it could occur a few days later or a week later or whatever the case is. So that's where temperature comes in. It can really help to confirm those signs. And I think that, when I talk about optimizing your chances of conception and learning fertility awareness to be able to feel really confident about this, it's like a two-parter. Like one, we have to know when are the best days for sex. And like I said, I went on about the mucus. So the best days are when you have this peak quality is what we call it, but peak quality mucus, that's the clear, stretchy stuff, or the slippery sensation, right? And then the second part of it is to confirm ovulation. So to make sure that we confirmed so that it happened, Because what can happen is if we think that ovulation is happening on day 14, then we have this bias in our mind. And let's say maybe you had some mucus and maybe maybe you had a positive test or, predictor kit or whatever, but then maybe something happened and it delayed it. So, 4 days later, you see more mucus, but in your mind, you thought, well, it was day 14, so I must have ovulated. And you just ignore that and you don't have sex. And that is the problem because then maybe you actually inadvertently missed the optimal time. So what I do a lot with clients is try to just educate them on how this really works. And then we kind of have to like put aside what I call our rhythm method thinking, where we really think about this day 14. Like a lot of women, they don't know anything about anything related to fertility, like all this fertility aware stuff that I just talked about, but they know that they should have sex on day 14. And so they make sure that that happens all the time, but that might not be the best strategy. And you might inadvertently be using the method for birth control. Like you didn't even know there was a method or that you were using it, but you're using it for birth control if you were.
I I appreciate everything that you're saying because it's like if only I had known this back in 2018 after my husband's reversal, like I thought I knew what, you know, they taught me in 6th grade, I guess. That's all I knew.
Well,
And
what they taught you is that you would just get pregnant regardless, like any time, any act of sex, regardless of when. And I went into a bunch of detail in the conception chapter of my recent book with Lily, The Real Food for Fertility. And I found all this research, and there was this one research study that was really interesting because they were looking at the percent chance of sex based on where you were in the cycle. So the highest chance would be literally the day before ovulation. That was like a 30% chance, I think, in the study. But what they did was they quantified, like if you just had sex one random time, so you just like, threw up a, like, I don't know, like one of those lotto balls and you just picked a day of the month and you just randomly had sex on one day only, there was a 3% chance of pregnancy. Like it's just not like it might not even have been three, but it was something like three or one or two or something like that. And that should tell you a lot of information. So what I always say is that timing isn't everything because there are obviously situations where there's other factors, there's other factors impairing fertility. So there are cases obviously where there's multiple different factors that could be having a negative impact on your chances of conceiving. But without correct timing, you don't have anything. So it's not everything, but you actually like you need to time it correctly to be in the game. And so one of the challenges with being in the fertility awareness world and when you have clients and they're charting their cycles and obviously fertility challenges are very stressful and some couples get into just due to the stress of it, they're not necessarily having sex all the time anymore. And so it might be that they're having sex like once or twice a month on day 14 usually, right? And so one of the challenges is that when I'm looking, so let's say I'm working with a client, we're looking at her chart on her menstrual cycle chart where she's tracking, let's say, her temperature and she's tracking her mucus. She's also typically tracking her sex, and that's something where it like I actually do need to see that just to check in, make sure that we're timing it correctly if we have to have a conversation about that. And I've had clients where, it's like, okay, so I'm looking at your chart. Have you marked all acts of sex on the chart? And it's like, yes. Do you realize that you didn't have any sex in the window? Yes. But in the back of their mind, they still think that there's a chance because maybe they had sex at a different time. Because again, the 6th grade education told us that we can get pregnant on any day. And so one of the biggest challenges with the timing aspect is you can have a couple who's not necessarily hitting the right days, but every time their period comes, they feel like it was a try. It's just as devastating. So it's really important. Like I said, it's not everything. There's a lot more we can talk about with optimizing fertility, but the timing is essential. So without the correct timing, you can't get pregnant. Like, and that's why the method is up to 99.4% effective as birth control. Because if you're not hitting the window, there's no egg. And if there's no egg, there's no chance of a baby. So there's that.
man, such like good information because I mean, you talk about like when the period comes, like I see this so often that there's so much emphasis and focus on timing and strips and whatever. And people who've been trying for a long time have told me that they almost reluctantly had sex because they were already automatically assuming that it wasn't going to work. So they went into the moment already in a negative and stressed space. And then it's like when it takes longer, I mean, even just like if you've never been tracking your cycles and you start the moment your husband has his reversal, it's going to take you some time to sort of dial it in and figure it out. So if you're not doing that in advance, you may not be at the right time. But I'm curious if you can talk about how stress or your emotional health can play a role even in irregular cycles. And what do you recommend for women who are just feeling overwhelmed in their journey?
I mean, there's so much there. I think the first thing that comes to mind is that, and again, I'm biased given my background in fertility awareness charting. I've spoken to a lot of women who've been given really interesting, questionable advice from their doctors and primary care providers. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of women who've been told to just have sex every other day, like forever, indefinitely, just every other day. And there's women who've been told to have sex between days 8 and days 15 or whatever. And so there's just a lot of advice that I feel like has, and I had a client who actually told me that her doctor told her to have sex like 5 times a day to increase her chances. Like you would think I was making that up, but she actually told me that. So that's, I feel like sometimes that stress of feeling like you have to have a lot of sex, or some people will, their practitioners are telling them just have more sex. You're right. Like the reason you're not getting pregnant is because you're not having enough sex. So I think I'll get to the impact of stress on the menstrual cycle, but I just want to kind of touch on that a little bit because from my perspective, what educate like so it can charting and tracking and doing the OPKs can certainly be stressful. But I want to share a different perspective because what I've found as well is that the education of understanding the biology behind what's going on, it can actually help because if you understand that according to the science, there is literally 6 days of your cycle where pregnancy is possible. And the reason is because, the sperm can live inside of your mucus for up to 5 days. And so when you have sex 5 days leading up to ovulation or on ovulation day, that in the research has been shown as the window. And outside of that, there's a very limited chance of conception actually happening. So what I think that can do is that it can take the pressure off instead of this like every other day feeling like I have to have sex all the time or not understanding how to identify that window and just feeling like you just have to have sex and feeling like every time you have sex is a try also. Because I think when you clarify the window, then if you do feel like that stress, and I think that's perfectly normal, natural, because it is a very stressful thing, right? Trying to conceive and this whole process. So, but knowing that there's like this window and it's like literally like 6 days and knowing that, those are the days that it counts. I feel like that can be really helpful. And I know that some of my fertility clients, you can kind of have that conversation of like, well, when it counts. So like you can also have sex outside of the window just for fun because it doesn't because there's sometimes there's things that we'll do when we're trying to get pregnant. Like we'll only be in a certain position or we'll hold our legs up afterwards or whatever superstitious thing we're doing, right? That takes away that fun, spontaneous, more laid back, approach to sex that we may have had with our partners like back when we were dating and so I think I just want to share some food for thought because I do feel like when we demystify the process and we actually know what's going on, and I know that tracking can be stressful for a lot of women, but I feel like from another perspective, it's like if you know that it's only like basically a week, then you have 3 other weeks in that cycle where you could just like have sex for fun and know that it doesn't count, know that it's not like, and just enjoy it. And I've often said to clients as well, like maybe because I'm nosy, I don't know, but if we're just doing the sex only it's almost like you're going to like the candy dispenser and your husband's like a like a slot machine or he's like a sperm donor and like you just click the button and just that's what he's for. And I don't know, I've never been a man, but I feel like maybe that wouldn't. I mean, I stereotypically men would just be happy like that but from the other hand, I feel like I don't know. I just feel like maybe that's not the most optimal situation, I feel like. So anyway, so I just wanted to share that thought on that because yeah, I've just worked with different clients and I've just seen different trends, and I feel like that can be a game changer to take the stress off and also counter some of that bad advice so that people feel like they're constantly trying. I feel like it would be just awful to feel like you're like 30 days out of a month, like you feel like every time you have sex it's a try, and like you always have that emotional anxiety around it when it could literally just be this 6 day window and the rest of it you could just chill and enjoy life. And in terms of how stress can impact the menstrual cycle, so there's different ways. I mean, there's acute stress and then there's chronic stress. And so acute stress is are those situational things. Like I said, like the sister getting married, you know, like you've got the traffic, you've got that work deadline. And so if those types of stressful events are happening before ovulation, sometimes they can delay ovulation a bit, extend the cycle a little bit that way. If you're going on a trip or something like that, you're in a different time zone. So if you are tracking your cycle, it can be helpful to note those things down in your app or on your piece of paper, just when you had your travel or when you had that rough night of sleep or whatever. It doesn't always mean that it's directly correlated. I've had clients who were like all prepared for their cycle changes and they went on a trip and they were like, oh, it actually didn't affect it that much. But I've also seen many occasions when those things can affect it. And, you know, post ovulation, so stressful events can result in lowering of progesterone, shortening of the luteal phase. Sometimes some spotting can be taking place. So those are some like really specific things. And of course, there's the overall general kind of chronic stress that could impact hormone levels, impact cortisol levels, and potentially have a negative effect on fertility in a more general sense. So certainly there's a lot to that.
Well, and I appreciate you even just kind of l- like laying out the whole fertility awareness method because I do see a lot of people, you know, who will ask in the groups about, you know, are you going to have your husband get another vasectomy after you've gotten your baby? And that opens up a whole other rabbit hole of things. But I'm kind of like, why would you spend all of the time and money to go through this? Because most people have, you know, they've had reversal, and if they're in this community, they've regretted that decision for various reasons. Some people do it for health, but usually it's to have a baby. But then to like go and redo that all, and I'm like, you do realize like there are things that you could do in that very small window that are less invasive than going through another procedure. So anyway, I've had people message me that have been thinking about like getting vasectomy or whatever just as a form of birth control. And that's kind of my thing. Like, if you just really educated yourself,
Yeah.
it's really not, you know, there are things you could do and be okay. So for the same, like if you're on birth control, because that's a whole other
Yeah.
thing as well. But anyway, I appreciate that very much. And because I'm like from the like nutrition side, and I know that you have a book with Lily about it, but how does nutrition impact your cycle health and ovulation? Are there any specific foods or nutrients that you would recommend to just really help in this process?
Well, I mean, the short answer is yes. There's a whole lot. I mean, the book is like legit 400 pages. I don't say that to make it sound intimidating. I think one of our strengths, Lily and myself, is that we do break down a lot of complex research articles and things into a very approachable way. So it has enough data and information to be a textbook, but it doesn't feel like a textbook. And I recently read a book that was also high research kind of driven, and it read very much like a textbook. And I was like, oh, we actually do have a thing going on here. But to answer your question, I think that often we're looking for this like magical nutrient and this like all, you know, and I think what's helpful is to understand a lot of the kind of nutritional foundations. So before I would even get into specific foods, which I certainly am happy to, I would say that kind of like the number one thing that I see that impacts the menstrual cycle is literally eating enough food, like balancing your macronutrients and getting a sufficient amount of protein, fat, and carbohydrates in a good balance. And it seems kind of simple, I think, too simple to be true. But what I found over the years is that, again, when I'm working with clients who are tracking their menstrual cycles, I outlined a lot of those no normal parameters. And one of the parameters that we can look at also is the body temperature. When you're doing a basal body temperature reading and you're taking your temperature every day before you get out of bed, so the oral reading or is when you're getting like the true basal body temperature. I would say just if you're using the devices, they work really well for confirming ovulation, but there's devices for the arm, the wrist, there's all of these different devices, and they have algorithms, some of them, and so those devices don't always give us the actual like basal body temperature, which is our resting metabolic rate. But they do give like an average sleep temperature, just to put that out there. But a lot of women, when they start charting and they start taking their temperature, they might notice that their temperature is super low. Like I created a charting workbook and, it's a paper book. So I had to pick a range of temperature, and I intentionally chose like a normal range. And so I'll get emails from people as like, where's the chart for the lower temperatures? My temperatures are off the chart. It's like, well, that should be a hint that they're too low. So I'm not going to make a special book. I want you to have that gentle nudge that they're too low. So where I was going with this is that when women start tracking their cycles, one of the things that can show up is this like low temperature situation. And I've just worked with a lot of women, I would say particularly women in their 30s and early 40s. A lot's going on in that age. As we get into our 40s, we start to get easier to put on weight. So there's a lot of women, we're starting to work out more. Instagram, I'm going to call out Instagram. There's just 100 diets, and everyone has a curated feed. Like when I was growing up, there was like the one television and everyone watched it and like everything was unified. And now everyone has different news and different stuff. So you talk to 10, 50, 100 different people and you ask them what's healthy, they're all going to tell you something different. And they're going to tell you about this great influencer that they're following that's probably male, who's telling them to do intermittent fasting or to do whatever. So what I've seen a lot of is that, you have women who are charting their cycles, they're struggling with short luteal phases, like low progesterone issues, spotting, their temperatures are off the chart, so to speak, really low. And then when you have the conversation with them, it's like, well, they're intermittent fasting, they're only eating 2 meals a day, if that. And then if you have them, track their protein, they're not getting enough and all of that kind of stuff. So I would say before we even start the conversation of which foods, we really have to look at, okay, we need to get enough food in your body. And if you are active, we need to make sure that you are consuming enough to offset that activity level. We need to ensure that you have sufficient protein. Protein has the greatest thermogenic effect on the body. It is absolutely essential, but so is fat, because fat, particularly animal fat, so cholesterol is is what our hormones are made of. So when I'm talking about all this estrogen and progesterone and testosterone, it's like, again, sixth grade was apparent. Like we're like really kind of knocking sixth grade here. But at the end of the day, we also didn't learn a good nutritional foundation in school. It's just not a thing that we learned. I mean, I learned about the food pyramid. I did not learn about the macronutrient categories. And I feel like that's really, really useful. So, in our book, Lily does a really great job breaking this down and providing that basic nutritional education so that we understand what's actually important. So we need our protein, we need our fat, and then we also need our carbohydrates, and we need them in balance so that we maintain a balanced blood sugar, but so that we also have a sufficient basis and foundation of nutrition for our body to actually make the hormones that it needs in the right quantities. So there's the starting point. 3 meals a day is our recommendation. We talk about intermittent fasting. And when you have fertility goals specifically, so when your goal is to balance your hormones or to conceive, we need to have optimal hormone balance. And so this is one of the reasons that I love the charting aspect so much. And one of the reasons that I always talk about the importance of using the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, because you can see in real time whether or not a woman is eating enough food for her activity level. If she's not, you're going to see the signs right there. And when she corrects it, you see the chart shift and move into the right direction. And then we can start talking about the specific foods. So, I mean, we take an ancestral nutrition approach in Real Food for Fertility. And we talk a lot about the research of what foods and nutrients specifically support egg quality, sperm quality, overall menstrual cycle health, hormone balance, and also to prepare you for pregnancy. Because I mean, Lily's second book, Real Food for Pregnancy, really highlights the importance of a nutritional foundation during pregnancy. But within this book, we're preparing you for that. And there's no situation, there's no event that is going to require as much of a nutritional input as building a baby with your body for a 9 month period of time and then breastfeeding said baby for however long. My daughter is 2.5. I am still breastfeeding her. I keep like thinking she's going to lose interest, but no, she's not losing interest. Like we're still breastfeeding. So she's still sucking out my nutrients. And so, with all of that in mind, I mean, some of the foods that we talk about liver and organ meats. Interestingly, before if you're like me and you're like a curious person, I have all these different thoughts and questions flying in my mind. And we didn't always have vitamins. Like 200-300 years ago, they didn't have vitamins. So what did people do before you could go to the store and buy vitamins, right? So they used to eat liver, organ meats, like fish eggs. There's a lot of interesting research around that. And when we look at the nutritional makeup of liver in particular, it is really, really high in so many of the key nutrients that we need for optimal fertility as well as pregnancy. And it's just so interesting. High in vitamin A, high in B vitamins, particularly B12, folate, choline, iron. There's just so much there. We talk about the importance of incorporating fish and seafood. So much of the seafood has in zinc and B vitamins. And if we're looking at omega-3 fatty acids, if we're eating our fish with the skin, I always say eat the skin on, but we're also getting those omega-3 fatty acids that are really essential for supporting egg and sperm quality. And I mean, we talk about full fat dairy, minimally processed, and again, the healthy fats that we need to make our hormones instead of eating, the skim milk and the skim milk products, really looking at all of those things. I mean, I could continue. I could talk about this a whole lot. I think for sperm quality, there's some really interesting research about leafy green vegetables, antioxidant foods, even citrus fruits, and obviously the dark colored berries and those kinds of things. But ultimately, we need to start with that strong foundation to ensure we're getting sufficient macros, because without that, you just can't, your hormones can't be balanced if you don't have enough nutrition on board. Specifically, if you're under eating, it's not a thing. And the menstrual cycle doesn't lie. So that's what I love about it, because it's not about me trying to convince my clients of anything. It's literally about us charting and then looking at the chart together. And then I'm not the one who has to talk. It's just like, look at it.
Hmm. Oh my gosh, so many good nuggets of information. Definitely will have the links to the books, and you have a podcast.
Fertility Friday. Look for the
And
pink one. There's like someone else. There's another podcast now that's called Fertility Friday. I was like, oh man, but just look for the pink one. There's a theme going on
England.
here.
And I'll make sure that that gets linked in the show notes, because I love what you're saying, and it's kind of what I always preach to my clients. Like everybody wants to know what supplements to take, and I'm like, well, nutritionally, what does that look like for you first? Like let's build this foundation and then get very strategic if we need to supplement, because if you're eating properly and enough, you might not need to spend the hundreds of dollars on supplements that may or may not be causing you digestion discomfort.
I'm certainly not opposed to supplements, but to your point, I think that they should be like literally supplementing an optimal diet and curate it based on your particular needs.
Yes, and that's kind of but in Facebook communities, what worked for Mary's sister's cousin, that you just want to know what the shortcut is, and
Yeah.
unfortunately, that's just not how it works. So I love everything that you've said. There's so much to unpack here. Definitely check out the resources that she has. But before we jump off, if a woman is listening and they're struggling with their regular cycles, maybe they're feeling hopeless, what is the message that you want her to take away from this whole conversation?
Hmm. It's a good question. I mean, I would say the message is that you really can improve your menstrual cycles. And although it probably seems like a mystery because none of us were taught any of this information, it really, you have so much more knowledge and opportunity than I did. I mentioned that I discovered this knowledge when I was about 18, and that was, how old am I? That was like 24 years ago. And so, at that time, there was no Instagram. There was no YouTube. Like there was none of this information. We had to go to the library to find information about this stuff. So I would say that the good news is that it can be a bit of a challenge because now there is a lot more noise and it can be harder to find good sources. But I think the positive thing is that there's a lot of really, really good information and resources. Of course, I can share some of the resources I've created as well, but there's a lot of really great resources and information. And although it can feel very overwhelming, it can feel like there's just so much that you didn't know. Most women, when they start charting their cycles and they start even just starting to understand how their cycles work and just starting to develop that basic body literacy of understanding, cervical mucus is related to ovulation and all that kind of stuff. Once you get into it, a few cycles in, it starts to feel like old hat. And then you start to get upset because you're just like, this isn't actually that hard. Why did nobody tell me that? And then you end up starting a podcast and going on about it for years to come and educating all the other women because that's what happens when we get upset. So I don't know if that was a good answer, but I feel like that is my answer today.
It's amazing. And before we jump off, just if somebody's driving and whatever and isn't looking at show notes, tell us how to find you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. So you can find me on the socials. You can type in Fertility Friday. So my favorite place on the socials is Instagram. So I post there pretty regularly. As you mentioned, my podcast, Fertility Friday, is now in its 11th year. How old am I? Of production. We have over 550 episodes, so there's like a lot going on there. So just type in Fertility Friday in your favorite podcast player, look for the pink one, and you will find me. And the books that we were talking about, my first book, The Fifth Vital Sign, is really highlighting this concept that the menstrual cycle is a vital sign that we should be paying attention to. And it does go into that fertility awareness, knowledge, and information that we were talking about today in a lot of detail. So you'll be, thrilled with all of that information. If you're specifically trying to conceive, Lily and I wrote Real Food for Fertility for you. We felt like it was needed. So I had my book, The Fifth Vital Sign, but then when my clients were trying to conceive, I was always referring them to her book, Real Food for Pregnancy. And similarly, when clients were trying to conceive, she was always recommending my book, The Fifth Vital Sign, so they can understand their menstrual cycle. So truly we came together and we really focused on fertility specific research. And you'll see that all throughout the book. And in my sections, I'm focusing on the strategies to optimize your cycle for conception. And honestly, there's just no resource like it. Between the nutrition information and the charting information, you'll be so much more empowered in your journey to conception. So realfoodforfertility.com, you can actually get the first chapter for free over there.
It's awesome. And I'm excited because Lily's going to be on the show in a couple of weeks. So I'm very excited to dive in because I geek out on the nutrition side quite a bit. So thank you so much for taking the time and pouring all of your amazing wisdom and just light and love to people who just want a baby like yesterday. So I appreciate that very much because I feel like there's so many good nuggets of information and certainly they can come find you to help dive into some more of that in their unique situation a little bit more. But thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been my pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining me on Conceiving After Vasectomy Reversal. I hope you're feeling encouraged and more hopeful on your journey to growing your family. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who could use a little extra support. I absolutely love reading your reviews. They mean the world to me. Like seriously, words of affirmation are my love language. So let's stay connected. Find me on Instagram at conceivingaftervr and join our Conceiving After Vasectomy Reversal Facebook community for even more support and encouragement. I believe that God placed the desire for a child on your heart for a reason, and I'm grateful to walk alongside you in this season, to encourage you, and to help you find joy in the journey, trusting that His plan is greater than we could ever imagine.
Thanks for listening.